everybody. Thank you for joining. We are very excited to be hosting this Shiur with Rabbi Hanoka. Rabbi Hanoka has in the past given Shiurim for Machon Smicha, and everybody involved enjoyed them tremendously. So we're very privileged and honored to have Rabbi Hanoka back with us. He doesn't need any introduction, but for those who don't know, Rabbi Yitzchak Hanoka is the senior rabbinic coordinator at the OK Kosher, someone who's involved in Kashrus, at the cutting edge of Kashrus issues on a day-to-day basis. And, who better to talk about what's practical, but also to some extent complicated questions of Kashrus, of medicine and vitamins when it comes to Pesach. So on that note, I'm going to pass it on to Rabbi Hanoka, and Rabbi, you can take it away.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Kesselman. To begin with, I'd like to thank my colleague, Rabbi Elisha Rubin, and my friend, Rabbi Pinchas Durval from the Chav K, for their technical assistance in helping me prepare for tonight's shiur. My role today is to provide halachic insider information on the industry at large so people can make informed choices. So vitamins and medication on Pesach. To properly understand the subject matter and the details of the industry, I want to give a general hakdama on the difference between fermentation, extraction, and synthetic processes. Medication is usually made through a fermentation process or through a synthetic process, where various chemicals are reacted together to create the desired product. Generally speaking, when it comes to medication, it's the inactive ingredients that serve as binders which can present challenges for Pesach, as they can either be lactose-based, which would be dairy but not chametz, or starch-based, which can come from wheat, although more often than not, it's usually derived from non-chametz sources such as potato or corn. As I'll mention later, in countries such as Europe or Australia, wheat starch is more prevalent. On rare occasions, the active ingredient in medication may be a chashash chametz as well, but that's not as common. Most vitamins are produced using a fermentation process. This is referring to vitamins in pill form. In this process, the molecular profile of an ingredient changes. And this is very negea for us because although the end product can be called gluten-free, it still presents a potential challenge for Pesach. In contrast to the laws of Pas Yisrael, if you have a product that's gluten-free and does not contain oat flour, it's not in the gather of Pas. That's because when it comes to baked goods, you're taking those ingredients and not changing them in any radical way. You're just putting them into a flour substance and baking them. When it comes to making vitamins, on the other hand, if a product is gluten-free, it still does not mean it did not derive from wheat sources, because through the fermentation process, the gluten is essentially becomes gluten-free because it's turned into a sugar. So from a gluten-free legal perspective, it's called gluten-free, but halachically, if it originated from wheat starch, it's still a problem of chametz. So to delve further into the fermentation process, raw materials mixed with other ingredients and broken down to the point where the molecular profile of the raw material is changed. So if your feedstock, your starting material is going to be wheat starch, for example, as I said, it's usually not wheat starch, but in Europe or Australia, it's more common. It could be wheat starch, more likely. Then they ferment the wheat into sugar and then add a bacteria, which converts the sugar into whatever they're trying to make. At that point, the product will then be called gluten-free. But again, it's still a problematic for Pesach if the feedstock, the original material, was wheat starch-based. So therefore, just by seeing on a vitamin product, gluten-free, one should not erroneously assume, oh, it's gluten-free, did not start from chameshes minei dagan. It's not true. It's gluten-free because of the fermentation process, and the gluten is left behind through the converting into sugar. But if it originated from chametz, halachically, it's still going to be chametz. Another way of making vitamin products is through extraction. That's, for example, if someone's going to take a liquid vitamin, that's where the raw materials are put into what's known as a solvent or an extract, something that's often could be alcohol. So, for example, if I'm going to make vanilla extract, I'm going to soak the bean into an alcohol, and the flavor is going to get pulled out through the alcohol. The etzem profile is not changed. It just takes on a new form. It's starting off as a vanilla bean, and now I've converted it into a liquid. So for Pesach, extracted products are easier to research for this reason, because to define and to determine whether or not they contain kidneys or chametz ingredients, all the ingredients and the solvents and the extract material will be listed on the product label, usually. And then what's needed is to find out what was used as the extract. What kind of alcohol was used? Was it cane alcohol? Was it corn-derived alcohol? Was it chametz-derived alcohol, etc.? But one has at least a clue as to what needs to be researched by looking at the product label. As I said earlier, in America, wheat starch is more expensive than cornstarch, and grain alcohol is more expensive than corn or sugar-derived alcohol. Therefore, in America, it's less likely to be wheat-derived. With regards to herbal supplements, the herbs themselves are not a problem, but the alcohol or the glycerin can be problematic, which is the material that's used to form the extraction. If the product is certified year-round by a hechsher, then that's the easiest and best way to verify the material, whether or not it's only kitnius or whether or not there's a chashash chametz. You call up the hashgacha, find out about the extract material, about the solvent, whether it's the glycerin, or usually that wouldn't be such a problem. But if it's the alcohol, you want to make sure it's not chametz derived. And usually the hashgacha would be able to tell you that information. That's getting firsthand information, and that's the best way to do that. When it comes to tablets, some of them are glazed, and the glaze itself can be an issue because usually, again, as I said, in America, it's going to be kitnius based. But in Europe and Australia, it's more common to use wheat-derived ethanol. Happens to be, for some reason, which we don't really know why, vitamin C is more commonly fermented from ingredients that are problematic for Pesach. Now, that's the background about the food industry and the vitamin industry as a whole. What do we do about this information? So if a doctor tells someone that they must take a particular medication, whether it's for a physical ailment, a mental ailment, or an emotional ailment, they must take it, and we say to them to take it in a swallowable pill form, because that is shaloi kederech achila. That's it's not an ordinary way of eating. It's not considered to be food. And there's no shaila. That's what they have to do. I'm not paskening, but from what I've spoken to Chassidish Rabbanim, Litvish Rabbanim, from all walks from life, they all say that if a person has to take a pill, swallowable pill, as medication, they must continue taking it on Pesach if the doctor says they have to take it. Chas v'sholem for somebody to play around with such a thing. It's mamash b'koach nefesh, and one has to be mekayim the inyan of ushmarta miyoyle nafshi seichem. Chewable pills and liquid pills or liquid vitamins or liquid medication are a different story, because it's chewable or because it's a liquid, it's considered derech achila, and therefore it's much more problematic. So if someone's in that situation, the first thing we tell them is to try and get something in swallowable pill form, if they can take it. If you're dealing with adults, most adults can swallow a pill. If it's someone who cannot swallow a pill, then one must work with one's doctor and one's Rav to see what has to be done, and act accordingly. If it's a matter of pikuach nefesh, they have to do what the doctor says. They just have to figure out the best way to do it. I remember my shver, Rabbi Daniel Levi, Olav Shalom, telling me a story that he heard directly from a Svardish Rav, a very famous Svardish Rav in Eretz Yisrael, that was Leolenu coming back from a Levaya right after Pesach. There was a bacher who was taking medication, who had to take the medication. The doctor required him to do so, but because he was concerned about the medication containing chametz ingredients, he stopped taking the medication on Pesach, and lo yaleinu nebuch, he was nifter over Pesach. So I'm sharing this story because if we can all learn from this and make sure, those we know in our sphere of influence, to make sure that someone who has to take medication must take it in swallowable pill form. Now, with regards to someone who's not a choyle mesukah, not someone who the doctor says they have to take medication, someone in halachically would be in the category of a choyle neifel mishkov, which briefly means somebody who feels unwell to the point that they have to be lying down to alleviate their symptoms. So, for example, if someone has the flu, an ordinarily healthy person, they have the flu, so they're lying down to be able to rest and recuperate. Their life is not in danger. So when the Chachomim, this is of course speaking for the Ashkenazi community, for those Sfardim that eat kitnius, it will be a different story. But when the Chachomim aser kitnius, they did not aser it for choilim or for ketanim. So if there's a choila that's neifel lemishkov, someone who feels so unwell to the point where they have to lie down to alleviate their symptoms, or if it's for the needs of a young child, then they are allowed to take kitnius l'tzoyrech refuah for the sake of them, for their health. On the other hand, if someone feels generally fine, they're able to go about their day, they're able to function, but in halacha we call them, they're in the gather of what's called mechosh b'yamo. They're not really sick, but they're feeling a little bit unwell. Maybe they're feeling a little bit groggy. Maybe their head's a little stuffed, but they feel well enough to go about their day, to go wherever they're going to go. They don't have to lie down to alleviate their symptoms, to rest in bed. Such a choyle is not allowed to take kitnius on Pesach because they're not really considered to be a choyle. It's only mechosh b'almo. They're only feeling a little bit unwell. They're not really considered sick. Now that we've given that sort of hakdama, so to speak, how do we verify whether or not something only contains kitnius or has an actual chashash chametz? I guess we can say that's the $1 million question. So to begin with, just by reading the labels of a product, that's an insufficient methodology of determining what's inside a product. Just for one, in the food industry, the FDA does not require manufacturers, to list ingredients that are going in at less than 2%. So you can have an ingredient that's higher than shishim, let's say higher than 1.6%, less than 2%, that's going in, that's going to be chametz mamish, and you're never going to know by reading the ingredient label. Just parenthetically, I'll just share a little story. We certified a product years ago that was like a soy-based type of drink. It was really kitnius, be'etzim, but it did contain actual oat flour as a thickener. Oat flour is commonly used as a thickener in some drinks. And it was going in at less than 2%, higher than 1.6%, so it was not batal b'shishim, and it actually contained chametz gomer. So that's one thing we have to realize, is that it's never enough just to read the ingredient panel. To find out if a product is only kitnius or contains actual chametz, the best approach would be, if the product is kosher certified by a reliable agency, is well before Pesach to call up the hashgacha, get in touch with the rabbi who's in charge of that particular account, that particular company, and ask them the question. You can email the question sometimes: is this product actual chametz, a chashash chametz, or is it only kitnius? And most Rabbanim HaMachshirim, because they're intimately familiar with the ongoings of the factory, they should be able to answer that question in most cases. Sometimes they won't be able to find out because it's not always obtainable. But generally speaking, usually they can find this information out for you. Even when the Hechsher doesn't certify for Pesach, but because they have the formula information and they visit the factory, they usually can find this information out. Now, what about the lists that are available online, published by various people that do all sorts of lists? Basically, in short, Rabbi Levi, alav hashalom, was not a fan of articles about it. And the reason he was not a fan of the lists is because the lists are gleaned information, usually from phone calls made to companies. and you're speaking to people on the telephone, and you have to hope they're giving you accurate information, and you also have to hope that they understand what you're saying. So there's certain sketchy nature about this. Of course, it's the people making this list deserve a lot of credit because they're trying to help the tzibur, but it's important to understand that the list information is certainly not as accurate as information you have directly from a hashgacha that's certifying the product and has intimate information about the product. So if a person's in a matzav halachically where they have to take a particular product, so the list can only help because halachically you're allowed to take it, so you have the base protecting you, so to speak, and the list is good for that extra added level of comfort and protection. If someone knows in advance they're going to have to take certain vitamins. Now, how does halacha classify vitamins? So very simply, if a person's doctor tells them that they have to take vitamins every day to function, then it has the din of medicine. They should take vitamins in swallowable pill form. Even with saying that, if they're taking vitamins that are kosher certified, it's still a good idea to reach out to the hashgacha because very often they can find the exact same vitamin, which is vadai only kidneys, and a different vitamin, which may be a chashash chametz. And if the medicinal effect is equal, of course, we should try to take one that's only kitnius. So the way to do that is to speak with one's doctor first to get the medicinal diagnosis, so to speak, whether or not it's a medicinal requirement. And then you go to the Rav, and then you speak to the Hashgacha for information. If a product is not certified, if it's a vitamin product not certified and absolutely must take it, then as the category of medicine, again, swallowable pill form is the way to go. And do as much research as possible, but again, not with chas v'sholem, not listening to the doctor. You have to listen to the doctor and do whatever the doctor says. There's a story, just to illustrate a point, about a very chashuv Rav was asked a question whether or not someone's allowed to take medication on Shabbos. We know it's an issa d'rabbanan, a rabbinic prohibition, to take medication on Shabbos because of a chashash of shechika samimonim, of grinding up spices and things to prepare medications. So if someone's in a category of a chayla and a mishkav, they're allowed to take it. So the Rav Paskin, in this particular person's case, they were allowed to take medication on Shabbos. Someone questioned the Rav and said, you seem to be a little bit callous and a little bit lenient with regards to the Isser of Shabbos. So he said, no, I'm being machmer on pikuach nefesh. So we have to keep the greater picture in mind, that we have to make sure that we're properly guarding the inyan of pikuach nefesh. There was a Chassidish Rav who told me the following story, which I believe is quite powerful, which is what I want to share with the audience. Rav Afrati from Eretz Yisrael, who was the personal assistant to Rav Shalom, it happened about 15 years ago, called up the Chassidish Rav in Brooklyn, who was giving a hechsher on vitamins, and he asked him if these particular vitamins, they were in swallowable pill form, if they're chametz or only kitnius. So the Rav told Rav Afrati that they're just kitnius. And the Rav told me, he says, Rav Afrati passed on the information to Rav Elyashiv, and Rav Elyashiv took them on Pesach. He was 98 years old at the time. He was definitely in the category of a choila, at least neifel mishkav. He needed him to function, and that's the halacha. So here you had someone who was known as a Pesach Hadar in the literature world, and this is what he did. So we have to look at the Inei Chachomim and realize this is what Torah says, and this is what has to be done. Now I'd like to segue into a related topic, but a bit of a different topic as well. In Yonim about 50 Shulchan Aruch, things that I would dub it as technological tension. We live in a society in an age where there's a lot of technology and we constantly are bombarded by new innovations, new products, new processes. And in some cases, these new innovations make our lives easier from a halachic perspective. And in some cases, they actually complicate our lives. So I've collected just some examples of this so that we can help open our minds to this reality and help us kind of almost think and see and perceive things from this lens. So of course we know that CCTV today, having a camera system, you can have remote cameras put in very easily. That's a very useful tool, put in one's kitchen to be able to have a sense of mirtas If one has a goya in the house, again, you still have to have a yetzav v'nichnas, proper frequency in the house. But if you're checking the cameras and the goya knows that you're checking the cameras, that of course adds value, halachically speaking. At the end of Hilchos Pesach in Tafnun Beis, it brings down a halacha that if you have a keli that was beileya, that became absorbed, let's say it was used for chametz, and it was a keli that was used for in a hot water type of a setting. So let's say there was fire under the pot, and the pot boiled water inside there, and you had chametz in the pot. Now you want to kasher this pot for Pesach. So if the pot absorbed chametz through fire, it says you're not allowed to take boiling water that's boiled through chamei teveria, not through fire, and use that as the medium to use as the kashering medium to, let's say it's a large pot, to immerse the smaller pot that you want to kasher into that pot that's being now heated through chamei teveria. Because it's not a like-to-like situation. The absorption was done through fire itself. The kashering, the purging has to be done through fire itself. Why am I saying this? Because today we have induction burners, which are becoming common and popular. And induction burner is not real fire, it's magnetic force. And if you have a keli that's beleya through fire mamish, one is not allowed to use an induction burner to boil up water and to immerse and kasher that pot in an induction burner heated vessel. Just keep that in mind, because as we have alternative forms of heating up foods and cooking, we have to keep in mind that when we're kashering, we have to use something that's heated through fire mamish to kasher with, if the absorption was with fire mamish. As an aside, induction burners also present another challenge, a bishul akum challenge, because when it comes to other fires, let's say, for example, a gas stove or an electric stove, in mashgichim in restaurants, I'm sure can relate to what I'm saying. The first thing they do when they come into a restaurant, they turn on all the fires so that the cooking can begin bishul yisrael. So a Jew is involved in the cooking process. So when you have the fire turned on by a Jew and the fire stays on all the time without anyone turning it off, then it's rather straightforward. You turn it on and you're good to go. But when it comes to an induction burner where the only heat is generated when you put the pot down on the magnetic disc, that's what activates the heat. So every time you put the pot down, you're creating a new heat, a new heat experience, which is a problem. Then the mashgiach would actually have to be the one to put down the pot every time, which is not practical in a commercial setting. So what the Chshedim do is they put in another disc on top of the original disc, and they screw that down to it. So you have a constant heat experience that was done by the Yid, and then you put the pot on top of that. So therefore the heat never shuts off. Just something to be aware of. Another example of technological tension would be with pilot lights. Pilot lights used to be much more common in home grade gas stoves. You'd have an actual burning pilot in the center of the range, and then when you turned on your gas burner, it would pull fire from the center range. Due to concerns about conservation of energy, most gas stoves are electronic ignition today, and they don't have a burning pilot, and therefore you don't have that backup system of having a burning pilot that was turned on by a Yid. So even if a guy would then, a non-Jew would turn on the fire under a burner, if it was coming from a Jewish fire, you have Eish Me'esh Yisrael, which b'di'evid is mutter, and you also have it being done in a Jew's home, which is another snif lahatir. So that would be a backup system. But today we don't have that because it's electronic ignition, or if it's an electric stove, you don't have it either. And therefore it creates more challenge in a kosher kitchen environment. On a commercial level, commercial stoves usually do have burning pilots inside on the actual burner. So if those are lit by a Yid, that does serve as a backup for bishul yisrael. And it's even better because there the pilot is actually on the actual burner itself. So it has the din of eish shel yisrael, not just eish me'eish shel yisrael, actual Jewish fire. Regarding convection ovens, they're more challenging because as you open the door, they're being heated through a fan and through blowing of hot air. And by opening the door, you're releasing all that hot air, and it cools down rather quickly. So that's one issue with regards to bishul yisrael. Sometimes they bypass that. But when it comes to kashering a convection oven, another thing to be mindful of is there's a fan and there's a plate. And a lot of times food builds up behind the fan and the plate. The proper way to do that is to actually remove the plate where the fan is to clean it properly before kashering. When it comes to kashering kelim, of course, the keli has to be cleaned. One has to be mindful when it comes to large commercial sized kelim. A lot of times the underbelly of the keli could be dirty as well, and make sure to look there as well, especially if it's not a flat surface that can be built up. Some kelim have like a large lip as well, a tilt kettle, so you have to be careful to look under the belly as well of that. Some kelim have a large patch in the front of the keli, which would say the name of the manufacturer. That's also an issue in halacha because there's the din of a tlaya patch, and you can have a possibility of having some food build up over there. So there, it may not be enough just to do hagola because you may not be able to remove the food residue. You may have to actually torch that area just to make sure everything gets properly removed. With regarding vessels that are jacketed, because companies want to preserve energy and they want to conserve energy, so it's very common in manufacturing settings where vessels are what's known as steam jacketed, which means the actual bottom third or bottom half of the vessel is a double wall. And inside that double wall, they'll inject steam that's coming from a boiler and it's run through pipes going back to the boiler once the vessel is finished heating up. So this way, the heat that the vessel generated does not get dissipated and sent down to the gutter, so to speak, but rather gets sent back to the boiler and it's already hot, so it doesn't have to regenerate the heat, so it saves on energy costs. This sounds all wonderful, but when you have a factory that produces kosher and non-kosher products, or kosher parve and kosher dairy products, this creates a problem because shared steam causes a problem of blia, of absorption, and you have shared steam problems. So the way this is dealt with is many different ways. One way is to actually bleed the steam and not to allow the steam to return. Another way to do that is to put in a davar apagim, like a bittering agent, where the steam becomes entirely inedible and it's totally bitter. There's a special chemical known as Bitrex, which works effectively in this regard. Just something to be mindful of. Electronic vessels that are heated through electrically do not have a problem of steam return, but they do have an issue. A lot of these electronic vessels also have a jacket, and very often they'll have a water loop inside there that's going to also get heated up and help the product heat. So if that water loop was also used for chametz, it's not enough just to clean out the actual keli. You also have to drain the water loop and refill it with fresh water before the kashering, so that also has to be bled, something to be mindful of before kashering such a vessel. I'll conclude with a story that highlights the importance and the fact that Torah Leiba Shamayim we spoke about many things that are relevant to the life of a Jew and a Jewess, and we have to follow halacha and lead balanced lives in a way where we can invest our energy according to the way Torah instructs us. Before I get to the story, I want to mention a word from the Rebbe. Rav Chaim Goldzweig was a well-known Kashrus expert, and about 50 years ago, he was by the Rebbe in Yechidus. He davened Sachari. His father was a Chassidish Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked him to speak for Neshei Chabad about Kashrus. So he said to the Rebbe, "The Yurei Mushleimim, what am I going to tell them? They're all Chassidish women who are God-fearing, running God-fearing homes. What am I going to tell them already?" So the Rebbe said, they're machmer on things that they don't have to be machmer on, and they're being makel on things they should not be makel on. So the way I understand the Rebbe's timeless teaching is that the Rebbe is teaching us to invest our koiches, our energy, in a place where it counts. To lead a balanced life, it cuts both ways. We can avoid sometimes the tendency or the temptation to get a little too kocht in things that are really not that important, or they're not necessary, and we can reserve those energies and those strength and that koyach in areas where halacha says we should invest it, and that comes through clarity, through proper education. I'll end up with a story that I heard from Rabbi Heller when I was in Koilel. The Brisker Rav's son went to bake his matzahs, and the Briskers are famous for doing all the mitzvahs with great zealousness and great hidurim, with a very high level of standard, etc. And he baked his matzahs. He was a great scholar, of course, being the son of the Rav. And after baking the matzahs, he was thinking to himself, okay, I did it with all the best hidurim possible, but maybe I could have even done another hidur, who knows? On the way back, he's carrying his matzah. He meets a simple Jew who's also carrying matzah, and the two of them converse. And the simple Jew says to the Brisker Rav's son, "Where are you coming from?" He says, "Oh, I'm coming from baking my matzahs, and The simple Jew says, oh, interesting, I'm just coming from baking my matzahs as well. And he says to the brisker Rav's son, I'm a simple Jew, and I don't know all the laws of Pesach and baking the matzah, all the hidurim, all the stringencies. So I daven to God that God should be my partner, that I should merit to have the best possible matzahs. So all of a sudden, in the mind of the brisker Rav's son, he's thinking to himself, maybe the simple Jew has more mohuder matzahs than I have myself. He says God's looking out for him, and all that. So he says to the simple Jew, I'm willing to give you my matzah if you give me your matzah. So the eyes of the simple Jew lit up like the heavens. He said, I'll be delighted for this arrangement. So the simple Jew gives his matzah to the brisker Rav's son, and the brisker Rav's son takes the matzah of the simple Jew, and they both go on their happy way. And then the brisker Rav's son comes home to his father and recounts the entire story to his father, the brisker Rav. And the brisker Rav tells his son, it appears as though Hashem answered the tefillahs of the simple Jew. Thank you.